Mary Catherine McClaine Larson. Mary was born March 13, 1880, in Duanesburg to Peter and Joanna McClaine. She had 5 stepbrothers and sisters from her mother's first marriage. Please take a few minutes to read about Joanna. They had a hard go of it but made the most of it. They lived on a small 15-acre farm. From my reading, it's approximately at the top of where Larson Lane is now, on the Bosanquille River side. They tended their small plot as well as worked the nearby farms. Even her mother Joanna was known for her hard work. She was the first child after Joanna remarried. Her father, Peter McClaine, was a farmer who lived in nearby Knox, New York, where he had worked on his father's farm. I do not know how they met or anything about their relationship. They continued to live on the same farm. Peter McClaine moved in with them and they had Mary, George and then John, 3 more children. Mary loved her education at the Weaver District No. 19 school, this located near where Weaver Road meets Schoharie Turk, but her granddaughter Frances, Fiddler, Collins writes in her memoir, 1 or 2 years she walked to Duanesburg District No. 5 school, this located in the parking lot of the Presbyterian Church. There was an excellent teacher. It added 2 miles to her daily walk, making it 4 miles per day. She probably went cross lots and used farm roads. It wasn't without issue either, for her mother made her a new calico pinafore when she arrived. The curtains of the Duanesburg schoolhouse were made with the same material as her new pinafore. She attained the unfortunate nickname of Curtains. Mary learned to sew, cook, milk cows, tend chickens and any number of other things needed doing on a small farm. From my reading and interpretation, the older Alexsons, her half-brothers and sisters, would have been working for nearby farmers as laborers and servants. The McClaines did have a decent-sized farm which the family would needs attend to, as well as the work they did for their pay. So, Peter, Joanna, Mary and most likely all the children learned to do the normal chores needs doing. Front LR Matilda and Anna, back row LR Julia Johnson, George and Mary McClaine. But Mary loved her education. She wanted to be a school teacher, and took the examination sometime before her 16th birthday. Unfortunately, the rule was you had to be 16 in order to teach, so she was disqualified. Sadly, her mother, Joanna, would start to experience poor health at this point. She took care of her mother and most likely many of the household domestic duties, due to her mother's failing health. Nearby, a young boy, who moved here from Norway, was becoming a young man. Lars Larson, who had moved to the area as a 10-year-old, was working on his father Barney Larson's farm. I do not know the exact location of Bohr's farm, but my assumption is that it is either next to or near Anton's farm, which was across the railroad tracks, and up the big hill. In 1900, Lars bought the 100-acre farm bordering Bohr's farm. This leads me to believe that Anton's farm was originally Bohr's farm. The farm he bought was from the Bratts, where Aunt Shirley currently lives. At the top of that hill, a girl was becoming a young woman who was taking care of her ailing mother. There is some conflicting information from Aunt Doris and Grandma Frances. Doris has Lars buying the property in 1900 and Frances has them renting until the first year of marriage when they bought it. During that year, 1900, her father sold the property and they moved to Pangbourne Road in Princetown, a farm that would expand to become McClaine's Hillside Turkey Farm. November 30, 1904, Mary McClaine married Lars Larson. Sister Annie Maybert came from Brooklyn and all the family came home for this wedding. Her mother, Joanna, had cancer and died on February 21, 1905. Lars and Mary Larson, wedding photo. My mother, Helen Larson Fiddler, told me a turkey dinner was prepared for the wedding celebration. Mary wore a mauve-colored dress with aqua velvet binding and ecru lace. It had mutton-style sleeves. After the wedding, Lars and Mary went to their farm just off the Schoharie Turnpike. Frances Fiddler Collins, when they first moved in, the house needed a lot of work. Anna Larson, Lars' younger sister, came over to help clean and wallpaper. She was very pleased with the result. Even the ceiling was a lovely white. Until the following morning, when they must have awoken to a fright as most of the paper had fallen off the ceilings due to a certain substance that prevented the wallpaper from properly bonding. After the shock and a small amount of vinegar, Mary had a close relationship with her mother and the passing of Joanna would affect her. Grandma Frances writes, a Phoebe built her nest on the front porch and that bird call always reminded her of that first springtime of her marriage and her homesickness. Her mother had died that February, which added to her loneliness. We still have descendants of that Phoebe building nests on our patio. She would experience more hardship as life progressed and much joy. She and Lars had 3 children, Helen, Howard, and Doris, and as their small family grew and farm flourished, they were devastated by the sudden passing of Lars October 22, 1922. only 3 years after Doris was born. I do not know the cause. I can only surmise that it was a heart attack, as his obituary only says died suddenly at home. The little family would move in with Anton and his family. After much discussion, we believe that this is when the house was converted to a two-family house. Either way, unlike many other widows, she managed to keep and continue to pay the farm's mortgage. She studied and became a practical nurse, and when New York licensed all practical nurses, she was one of the first to receive her license. A side note on Edith: Fiddler was also in the same group as Mary, along with family friend Mrs. Westphal. Her firstborn Helen grew into a fine young woman. A romance blossomed again between neighboring farms, the Fiddler farm, which was up where it is today on Fiddler Road off Weaver Road. A dashing young railroad clerk, Nathan Fiddler, fell in love with Helen. Many parties with the various family members of Littles, Fiddlers, Larsons, Alexsons were held. Nathan and Helen were married October 8, 1927, 5 years after the death of her husband, and a year later she would welcome her first grandchild. Frances Mary Fiddler was born November 5, 1928, followed 5 years later by Albert Fiddler October 26, 1931. In 1931, her son Howard Larson married Bertha Van de Veer. In 1933, they welcomed a daughter, Lois. Doris married Robert, Bob, Sutton in 1939, and in 1941 they would have a daughter, Mary's fourth grandchild, followed by Robert Sutton Jr. In 1942. 1941 brought two more grandchildren. Helen had Shirley and Doris has Anne, her sixth and seventh grandchildren. Great-grandma Mary Larson with Helen and daughter Shirley. The Depression years were very difficult, and she was a strong person who believed in a woman's right to vote. She worked for the Board of Elections from when it started in Duanesburg until her death. She was a very personable woman and very involved in the community. Her name is frequently seen in the Altamont Enterprise, in many locations. From visiting friends and relations, her sisters would visit from Brooklyn to events held at church or family homes. She may not have been a teacher but was involved in 4-H, the RSI. The Rural School Improvement. Another fun discovery I made was she was quite the player. There were many articles referencing Mrs. Mary Larson performing plays at church and local events. Mary Larson loved family, and there always was room for them, from housing her sister Matilda, Aunt Till, to working so they could all have a home to come back to. I do not know the particulars, but in 1948 her and her sister Till's health began to deteriorate. Matilda died March 25, 1948. And only 8 days later Mary died April 2 of 1948. The only information I found was in her obituary, which read died at the home of Mrs. Doris Sutton at Kelly's Station. My grandmother would be proud of this legacy.